show it. You can tell I spent a bit too much time on land the first day. I was red. Last night I said to my daughter, I have some white salt or something on my face. My skin's peeling. I'm getting a free peel out of the deal. We had fun. We traveled around, and it's funny. The ship is so absolutely, luxurious and commodious and gives you everything you want, but you kind of miss getting on land. I always wonder about 16th, 17th century explorers or immigrants coming over. I mean, if you saw the size of the Mayflower, it's tiny. And the idea of putting 101 people in there, one of whom's pregnant and gives birth, so 102, one dies. I guess you get rid of that person. And 15 or 16 crew, 3 dogs, 60 hogsheads of water, a couple of goats, 40 or so other animals of sorts, all in that little teeny thing, and primarily below decks for 5 or so weeks. I can't, I'll never complain again, you sometimes say about various things. And I often think that, too. When I miss a plane somewhere, I thought, damn, I got to wait 2 hours for the next plane. Just wait a minute, it used to take 4 months to go across the continent in a wagon train, and people tried to kill you. So it does all become relative, I know that. The title for today was 400 Years of the Dream or something, but it didn't say what the dream was. So I kind of wished it said what the dream was. It was curing baldness. No, that's not curing baldness. Curing the common cold, maybe. How about, oh yeah. You think this is real hair? No. It's maybe 400 years of world peace, trying for world peace. That would be more noble. No, it is 400 years. The dream is building a canal, or finding a waterway, not building a canal, finding a water transit across the Americas, finding some way of going from the Atlantic to the Pacific and back without getting off the ship. 400 years, so that was the dream, and to not know what the dream could have been, but I thought that was funny. Now, we all, by the way, who wears bow ties? Only 3 categories of people. Geeks, Englishmen, and no confusing the two necessarily, and professors. So I want you to know I'm a professor. Okay, so there it is. When we think of canals, actually when we think of canals, we think of grand, great structures. I was trying to think, when I started thinking of this lecture, on what are the great accomplishments of engineering in the world. And if you ask almost anyone, and they'll come up with 4, 5, 6, 10, almost everyone settles back on the Great Wall of China. It's hard to imagine any engineering feat as more spectacular. It's just shy of 4,000 miles. That's a long time. Just shy of 4,000 miles. Built over 1,700 years, and often had to be rebuilt because of being attacked. But a 1,700-year construction process, probably a bit of cost overruns, I would think. It's not just a wall. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen it. It's not just a wall. It's guard towers. It's assembly places. It's battle stations. In many ways, it's a linear urban phenomenon that also is a wall. But we are talking of walls today again, aren't we? 1,000-mile wall from here to there. This is a wall. Build a wall. You can imagine people in Qing Dynasty saying, we're going to build a wall. And 1,700 years later, I delivered on that promise. But it really, there it is. And there are other great things. The Great Pyramid at Giza, the Great Pyramid at Giza. It's hard we don't really understand how that was done. It was done in 20 years, as opposed to 1,700 years. It was done in 20 years. It involved moving 2.3 million limestone blocks 500 miles. It's just, we didn't have trains, we didn't have cranes. It's almost incomprehensible how it was done. It's a bit like Stonehenge. We really can't figure out how the engineers did it, how they moved things that far. Now, in my lifetime, I remember being a little boy going out in, I think, 56, maybe 57, with my father to watch Sputnik go over the Earth. Remember that? Many of you, the same thing. And you're looking, and as small as it was, by the way, the size of a basketball. It was really small. And the idea that would be such an extraordinary accomplishment in the world of technology and engineering and scientific endeavor, and it was. And I remember seeing it made a little binging, a little blinking sound. I remember being so excited seeing the first man-made object in space. Now today we have the International Space Station. The International Space Station is 43,000 cubic square feet. It's slightly longer than 3 Greyhound buses. If you can imagine in 1957, that little basketball and what a feat that was, and now for 20 years we've had the International Space Station, a huge office complex, 2,200 miles above us. Most recently, I was looking at various, trying to find out great projects. The Palm Isles of Dubai. Do any of you know the Palm Islands of Dubai they're building? These are stunning. They are about 50 square miles each island. It's like building Manhattan 3 times. 1 is done, 2 are being worked on, and cities will be on them, beaches, entertainment centers. It really is like building Manhattan or building 5 block islands all at one time out of nothing. And it's just, I'm staggered by the sense that sometimes things that seem so incredible, things that simply beggar the imagination in one generation, are child's play 20 years later. I had a childhood friend who was a smart kid. He became a chemical engineer, and he would pack a briefcase. He worked for various oil companies. He would pack a briefcase and go to a country and come back 5 years later, and there'd be a refinery there. If you've ever seen a refinery, I have no idea how anyone could design a refinery. There are thousands of miles of pipes, and everything has to go right or something goes boom, I assume. He would go with a briefcase and plans, and architects would come, and 5 years later he would leave, and there'd be this giant refinery that would produce zillions of gallons of refined petrol for the world. The Brooklyn Bridge opened in 1884, and the entire, the President Chester Arthur, who, by the way, was from New York, so he had a reason to go, but the entire cabinet went. It was such a feat of monumental construction. Now we can build a bridge. Any old bridge company can build the Brooklyn Bridge pretty easily. The Empire State Building. It was a wonder of its time, and for 40 years, the tallest building in the world. Now, almost every year, every other year, some building is built that's bigger than it is. So there's a record here of accomplishment that just beggars most of us imagination. I don't know. I used to say to my friend Steve, how do you build a refinery covering 5 square miles with pipes? He said, 1 pipe at a time. And I said, well, I know that, but that's a cliche. How do you build the Empire State Building? Well, you dig a hole, and then you start building a building. I know, but it just, for most of us who don't do that, it seems incomprehensible how it is done. But probably no construction projects have changed commercial interaction in the world as much as canals. Probably nothing in the world has changed as much the way the world flows, because a lot of engineering reconfigures geography, but nothing reconfigures it like building canals. Because what you do, in a sense, is you change the way the water is distributed on the planet to make it more convenient for human habitation. And I want to talk of 3 other canals before talking of the great one, for us at least, the Panama Canal, which is very nearby. Probably the greatest canal in the history of mankind matches the Great Wall of China. It is the Grand Canal of China. Has anyone here seen you've seen the Grand Canal? You have seen it, yes? Where did you see it from? Did you go to Hangzhou or Beijing or along the way? Pardon me? Hangzhou, yes. And, you've seen it both ends. I saw it last summer. I went to see it last summer. I taught at Hangzhou at a university there. And it connects Beijing with Hangzhou. It's around 1,100 miles long. And it's at one point, 5 million workers are working on it at the same time, simultaneously. It's really stunning. It was built in the 6th and 7th century. And when it was done, it was a grand highway of water that connected the Yangtze and the Yellow River systems. And it was done to carry grain from the south to the north. It was remarkably successful. At one point, we have data on the people working on it in the 14th and 15th century. Approximately 48,000 people were working on it continuously to maintain it, to make sure it didn't fall apart, and slightly over 100,000 people working on it to move the goods up and down on barges. And it not only was this gigantic 1,100-mile canal, which really, in terms of canals, is like the Great Wall of China. It beggars the imagination. Also, over 25 canals were built into it from the countryside from either side. And one engineer said it was kind of like recreating the Mississippi River and the Ohio River and the Missouri River. That is, having one grand waterway and having all these other waterways that drain into it to bring commerce to it. The difference somewhat being there were rivers there already, of course, because people say, where'd they get the water? They had to redirect existing water from mountains and other rivers and lakes to make it work to flood these places. But it all worked. It's like creating the middle of America in the middle of China. It ends at West Lake near Hangzhou. Marco Polo first talked of this in the West, and Marco Polo wrote extravagantly about West Lake and the river system there. He didn't give it the same name that we did Grand Canal, but it's what it was. And, oh, by the way, the G20 met at Hangzhou 2 years ago, and all the leaders went, here's the route of it right here. I have it up here. Forgot I had it there. You can see where it goes and how it drains right through the heart of China. This is the Grand Canal today, and it's truly a beautiful place. There are all sorts of... They lined the Grand Canal with trees on sides. They also lined with roads, and also it was built. That is, they have a built urban environment. It is like today when you see it, 1,100-mile linear city. Have any of you been to San Antonio and seen the Riverwalk? The Riverwalk's stunning. Every tourist wants to see it. You can go to Crazy Joe's and this and that and the Crab Shack, but it's about 1.5 miles long in terms of the commercial development. 4 miles long going up to the museums. This is like an 1,100-mile San Antonio walkway. There's simply urban development all the way up, places to eat. There are a number of villages there. I went to one called Wu Village, and they claim to be the Venice of China. Of course, a lot of places claim to be the Venice of here, the Venice of that. You don't hear Venice ever claiming to be something else either. But it is a strange linear city, and it has worked extraordinarily well. Today, it's not used for commercial traffic much at all, a little bit in the south, but it's a big, big draw for tourists. Now, there's a similar canal to the Grand Canal in the United States, and that is the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal is like the Grand Canal. It's entirely domestic. It doesn't affect, well, a little bit Canadian, but it's all built within the United States. It runs 363 miles from the Hudson River in Albany, New York, across upstate New York to Buffalo. Its real importance, though, is that it connects the Hudson River and the Great Lakes. And the Hudson River, of course, goes down to New York. When you look at colonial America, there were 5 great cities in colonial America, English colonial America: Boston, Newport, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. They all had reasons to be a great city. They were all roughly the same population. Newport might have been 1,000 or so less at various times. Boston drained the north along the shores and small river systems. Newport, of course, is on an island. It has no river coming in, but Narragansett Bay and all the places clustered around there and Long Island went there. New York had the Hudson Valley and was very protected because of Long Island Sound coming in. Philadelphia drained the Delaware and the Susquehanna Basin. Charleston has 2 rivers going in. What do they say in Charleston? Oh, Charleston's where the Ashley and Cooper River joined to form the Atlantic Ocean. That's a Charleston joke. The major European founder of Charleston was a man named Anthony Ashley Cooper, who became known later as Lord Salisbury. He became knighted. And the 2 rivers there, he modestly named after himself. But the point is, all 5 of these cities were about equal, and all 5 had claims for greatness and claims for economic preeminence in the backcountry around them. But once the Erie Canal was built, forget the other 4. New York outdistanced everything else. New York became the New York we know today, the New York of dominating commercial enterprise in the United States because of the Erie Canal. And like the Grand Canal, a whole series of cities and villages stretched along the Erie Canal, what New Yorkers today call the upper tier. You have Utica, Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo, and little canals, a couple of ones. One goes to the north, very important one, to Oswego. There's a whole sense. New York has New York and Long Island, which is urban, and then a whole area of rural New York, and then this urban area, the upper tier, all because the Erie Canal reconfigured the geography of North America. Now, the Erie Canal was pretty complicated technologically. It has 35 different locks. And here, this is the route we see here. And of course, ultimately, it doesn't just connect to Lake Erie. Little canals, other canals, make it connect to all of the Great Lakes. So if you're from Minnesota, if you're from the Iron Range, New York City is your port of exit. It's 1,500 miles inland. New York City is your port of exit. This is a very different look than the Grand Canal, isn't it? This is the Erie Canal. It was built in the countryside, and even though there are cities along there, it maintains this bucolic, charming look today. And traffic moved through 35 locks, but they were barges, they were never propelled, barges pulled by mules primarily, these are mules in this case, sometimes by horses. Remarkably, very few people died building the Erie Canal. There's a lot of talk of how many did, but most historians say really less than, well, if you're one of the people who died, it's not a good thing, of course. Whenever you say not many people died, it's, well, what about me, Jack? But probably less than 500 people died, which in terms of the engineering of that is remarkable. It was, by the way, conceived by a man named DeWitt Clinton. And he was in the same political party as Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson said, Clinton is daft. This is a little short of madness. And Jefferson, by the way, was a fan of technological things. Jefferson was a fan of innovation. But almost everyone thought DeWitt Clinton had lost his mind. He was governor of New York. He started in 1817. He had the revenge, of course, of living to see that he hadn't lost his mind, that he was the great man who changed the geography of North America. The importance, you can always tell the importance, by the way, of certain things in history by the number of songs and poems attributed to them. I think number one in American history is the Battle of New Orleans. There are more songs about the battle, including a number one rock song in the 1960s. You know, in 1814, we took a little trip along with General Jackson down the mighty Mississippi. We took along some bacon and we took along some beans, caught the bloody British in a town in New Orleans. We fired, as you can tell, I can't sing. We fired our guns and the British kept a-coming. There wasn't as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and the British kept a-running down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. And it goes on and on. Well, thank you. Be careful, you'll get more. But there are dozens of songs about that because that battle was so monumental. It was something like, I don't know, 2,400 British lost and 7 Americans. A lot of strange things configured. People were caught down below bluffs and they were hailing cannon fire down. The other thing about New Orleans was it was fought 3 weeks after the war was over. No one told the generals. There's no telegraph. The war is over. It's been signed, a peace treaty, and the Treaty of Ghent, and no one told them. But the Erie Canal has almost as many songs. I mean, some are pretty well known. Patti Page made a big one out of one of them. Let me see. Low bridge, everybody down. Low bridge, cause we're coming to a town. For you always know your buddy, you always know your pal when you're ever navigating on the Erie Canal. And other ones, the ERIA was a-rising, winds are getting low. I scarcely think I'll get a drink till I get to Buffalo. And the final one, not the final one, but one of the big ones is Buffalo Gals. And Buffalo Gals is a bit less savory, it's fair to say. Buffalo Gals, won't you come out tonight, come out tonight, come out tonight. Buffalo Gals was named for the women on Canal Street in Buffalo, which is where the canal men went when they got done their trip to relax in saloons and discuss world events with some welcoming ladies. It was always... Canal Street, by the way, was called in the 1930s the wickedest street in America, the wickedest street in America. Now, both these canals are domestic and primarily, well, exclusively done for domestic concern. Canada benefited greatly from the Erie Canal, but both of these are done by one government for one, you know. So it's relatively easy in a political sense to do something like this. Now, the other two canals I want to discuss, the Suez and the Panama, are different. They're much more complicated because they are international, and they also obviously are writ on a larger scale. The Suez connects the Atlantic with the Indian Ocean, and the Panama, the Atlantic with the Pacific Ocean. They both shorten the distance from around the tips of Africa and South America by an average of 4,000 miles per trip, though, of course, if you're coming from the northern latitudes, it can be 6,000 or 7,000 miles, coming from southern, a little less. But it's a huge savings for an average ship to be able to save 4,000 miles. I mean, just look at, you know, how efficient this ship is and how long it takes to go somewhere. 4,000 miles of fuel and energy and crew. And they both very directly affect the two. Remember the two comparisons I made the first day here between the Mediterranean and the Caribbean? Well, they both obviously go through one of those great seas to the other exit point. Both were very difficult politically to build. Both were very complicated technologically. The Suez is much, much longer, double the size of the Panama Canal. But the truth is the Suez was much easier both politically and technologically. For one thing, here's the route of the Suez. You can see there, it's not very long. I mean, it's about a little less than 100 miles. And this is what it looks like today going along. The Suez has no locks, by the way. In many ways, the Suez is almost not a canal. It's a big, long saltwater ditch. A big, long saltwater ditch. The first real impetus came for a canal there was from Napoleon. Though we know from when they were excavating, they found evidence that the ancient world had some waterworks along there. Various things were done. I don't think anyone thought there was the full connection of the two oceans that way, but there were canals off the Nile already. People, 1,000, 1,500 years earlier had done certain things. Napoleon became obsessed with it because, of course, it would give him tremendous advantage militarily to be able to move troops quickly from one place to another. He gave up, though, when he commissioned an engineering report that said there was a 35-foot difference between the two seas. And a 35-foot difference is pretty substantial. Where do we get to the Panama Canal? You would require many locks, so Napoleon gave up on it. But in the 1840s, a new corps of engineers determined that the two seas were substantially the same. And once they thought they were substantially the same, it was only a question of time. This is a man most people call the father of the Suez Canal. He's a French diplomat. Look at that face. That looks like a French diplomat, doesn't it? There's a certain something, savoir-faire to that. I had a mustache for 40 years, which I shaved because it turned snow white, but I do miss it. But there's a certain kind of savoir-faire, a certain kind of power to that man. Ferdinand de Lesseps. He was a diplomat who seemed to have been everywhere. He was in Rome, the Netherlands, Tunis, Portugal, but he spent more years in Egypt than any other posting. And when he retired from his posting from the French Foreign Service, and he left Egypt, he didn't leave Egypt. He stayed there and talked the rulers of Egypt into giving him a 99-year lease for a canal. He also talked them into providing labor for the canal. They would exclusively provide the labor, and it would be coerced labor. De Lesseps then formed something called the Suez Canal Company, which is pretty interesting financially. It sold shares to individuals, it gave shares to the Egyptian government, and it sold shares to other governments in Europe. So it was a combination, giving shares to the sponsoring, the local geography ruler, selling shares to people like you and you and you and me who wanted to make money out of it, and having governments buy shares. So the canal then was built by a Frenchman. It was built more or less under French law, but massively aided by Egyptian labor and Egyptian circumstances. And the biggest opponent, this is really interesting considering the future of the Suez Canal, the biggest opponent of the canal was England. Now, England opposed the canal because England dominated the oceans. The English private and public shipping dominated the oceans like no other country. No other country held a candle in any imaginable way. And England perceived that if the canal was opened, it would mean you would need fewer ships to do certain things. You would have shorter distances. You wouldn't have to go so far. And they thought that opening the Suez Canal would lessen English hegemony on the ocean. So they opposed it, and in one sense, but interestingly enough, the British government privately created dummy companies to buy shares in it. So England is opposing it, and they did not say they opposed it because they thought it would weaken British military power. They opposed it on the high ground that it would use coerced labor, and they were morally against using coerced labor, despite the fact they themselves were using coerced labor for all sorts of programs in India. But we all learn out of this that governments at certain times cannot always be trusted to tell 100% of the truth. We know things like that. And governments do things behind the board. So much of Europe invested as governments. Wealthy people invested, and England and Egypt provided the land and the workforce. They usually had only 30,000 people working at a time, and they worked for 3 or 4 months at a time. It was deadly working there. It was deadly working there, and they realized if you worked beyond 3 or 4 months, you probably would not survive. Death rates were high. But the truth was, it wasn't that big a technological challenge. They started construction in 1859, and it opened in 1869. And during that time, I'm sure if you're working at the work site at any time, it was hazardous, it was complicated, you were upset, but no one ever seriously doubted that it would open. Once construction work started, no one ever seriously thought, well, we can't do this or it's too much. It was just a question of getting the job done, digging the dirt out, moving it somewhere. And like the Grand Canal, within the other tributary canal, things were made to kind of go down to the Red Sea, so it became even more useful. So it opened in 1869 and was a massive success. No one had seen something that rearranged world commercial shipping like the Suez Canal. I mean, the other ones were canals, the Erie and the Grand Canal, within one country. This was everywhere in the world. It just rearranged the way the world traded with each other. Weirdly enough, it was always in financial straits. And we know now why it was in financial straits, not because it didn't make money, but because the investors all wanted a payoff. It paid far too much money to investors. It had far too many competing interests on the board of the company. So while it was making money, it was being built, and it was always kind of in financial disarray. Other problems. What to do during times of war. The Suez was meant to be open to all, and that was part of the deal when European countries invested. And of course, European countries are always at war with each other. What if you have investors on the board from different companies, different countries, and they, it's one country's interest to close it during war? It was always meant to be open to all, but war always caused problems. Now, ironically, in 1882, England, which had publicly so opposed the canal, took advantage of these financial shenanigans and mismanagement and problems. And in 1882, England ended up buying control of the canal. They bought control by buying out the Egyptian government shares. The government was being pressured by the British government and eventually became somewhat of a British protectorate colony of sorts. They bought the British government shares, and they had private individuals buy up large amounts of shares. So that part stayed in private hands, but they always voted in terms of British interest and British control. So after 1882, after opposing it so, England assumed control of the canal and held it till 1956. Most importantly, during World War I and World War II, they made sure it was an English Suez Canal. That is, they used it militarily during World War I and World War II, and it got a bad reputation politically among nations because it clearly was not open and freely open to all commerce, but was done to support British efforts. In 1956, of course, the British control came to an end in a real bang. And many of you may remember vaguely the Suez crisis of 1956. A lot of Canadians remember something out of that because what happened was Egypt became independent in a series of stages. As often happens, there are puppet governments and things, but a man named Nasser became the president of Egypt, and he was very much an Egyptian Muslim nationalist. He seized control of the canal, and England, aided by France, was going to seize control back. They sent paratroopers there. It looked like some flashpoint for a major international war. And the UN probably had its real first success story in averting something. The UN sent troops in, and the reason Canadians remember this is it was a Canadian foreign minister named Lester Pearson who suggested to the UN that they create their own police force, the now famous Blue Helmets. And the first use of the Blue Helmets was to go into Egypt to neutralize the canal, and they did, and no war broke out, and the canal was turned over to Egypt, where it has been ever since, and it was repatriated. Now, we come to our big canal, the canal we all are here to, with bated breath to hear about. The Panama Canal proved to be much more dramatic than the Suez Canal. The Panama Canal, at times, actually, its construction was bizarre. Now, why 400 years? Well, think back to what Columbus was looking for. Why was Columbus coming across the ocean? Where did he want to be when he was done? Asia. First voyage, he thinks he's in India. He calls people Indians. Second voyage, he realizes his mistake and says, I'm on the Malay Peninsula. Oh, again wrong. Third voyage, here I am Here I am. Where am I? In China. Okay. Columbus was looking for a way to get to Asia because Asia had trading goods that were so attractive. Silk and spices. How much does silk weigh? How much do spices weigh? They were worth a fortune in Europe. And the idea was that to somehow find a direct trading way to Asia. For a long time, North America was regarded by Europeans as a nuisance. If only this big, not North and South America, the Americas, if only this land wasn't here, it would be so much better for world commerce. Jean Cabot was a Frenchman hired by the English in 1497 to find a way through the Americas. Once Jean Cabot was hired by the English, he becomes John Cabot. So John Cabot is hired in 1497. He was the first person hired to explicitly find a way to get across this landmass, which he did not. Henry Hudson, an Englishman, hired by the Dutch. People always put their goods out for sale. Henry Hudson was also hired to find a way across the Americas. He explored the Hudson River, thought he had it. Wrong-o, he did not. Interestingly enough, in 1607, when English people first populated Virginia, if you're from that area, you know there are 5 really large rivers in the area, and they're very wide at the mouth. They're saline. For 30 or 40 miles, they're tidal rivers, and they look like huge. They look like the Nile when you see them, but they don't go very far. They go 50 or 60 miles, easily navigable into the interior. Then after that, become small streams and hit mountains in the rear. When people first went to Virginia, the Spanish in Mexico City were afraid that they might be able to attack them from the north. So little was known of the geography of the Americas and the interior, that the Spanish in Mexico City are terrified in 1607, 1608, that there are English people just north of them. Of course, they're in Virginia. They weren't. So little was known of the geography. But the river systems of Virginia also proved to be a bust getting through. The next was the St. Lawrence. People thought the St. Lawrence had great possibilities. It is a long river, and it does go down and ultimately now through canals connect to the Great Lakes. It, too, did not work out. When it was exploring the St. Lawrence, the English offered a bonus of 20,000 pounds to anybody who could find a navigable, year-round waterway across the Americas. That would be $10 or $15 million now. And you can imagine how many people were spurred by that to try to find some way of getting across. Eventually, by the 19th century, the decision was made by all, only the Northwest Passage. Only somehow wending your way through the Arctic Ocean would get you from here to there without building something artificial. And in 1906, the first ship did go through. A Norwegian ship went through the Arctic Ocean, but it took 3 years. And that's not commercially very viable, even though the first time often takes longer. And it was only partial part of the year. Part of the year you could not do that. It was frozen part of the year. The irony here, by the way, is that in 2006 and 2007, the melting has occurred so much, there actually is a passage now from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Forget the Panama Canal. It's a difficult passage, but a reasonable one that is not frozen. You can use year-round, and it is being used and will be developed more, no doubt about that. But gradually, people came to the conclusion that there would be no other way of doing it other than build a canal. And Charles V of Spain, the 16th century, first suggested it. Thomas Jefferson, who opposed the Erie Canal, thought it was dumb, thought it would be child's play to build a Panama Canal, and he suggested that to Washington when he was Secretary of State. Now, when the Erie Canal became the great success it was, people really fastened on the idea of building the Panama Canal, or a canal, not called the Panama Canal. And the United States entered into negotiations with Columbia in the 1830s and 1840s to get a route across that area. Columbia then was not the Columbia it is now. Columbia had been Grand Columbia, and that is the first country to emerge in northern part of South America as an independent country. Grand Columbia included modern-day Venezuela, modern-day Ecuador, parts of Brazil, parts of northern Peru. It was to be like the United States was, or like Australia, a large country, or like the Federation of the West Indies was in 1958, a large grouping of Spanish people to form a strong, powerful country. They tried negotiating with Colombia. Colombia was always fearful. Colombia was always fearful of American power, so they couldn't get a treaty with the United States. But Colombia did sign one. Colombia did sign one with England. So England now, left out somewhat at this time of the Suez Canal, just investing behind the scenes, England was the first person to try to get a lease and a land route across the canal, and then gold was discovered. Gold was discovered in 1849 in California, and gold being discovered changed everything. Once gold was discovered, suddenly there was this huge impetus. We have to get some way of getting across. The first response, by the way, to gold being discovered was that the United States built a railroad, and Colombia allowed it to build this railroad in modern-day Panama, the Panama Canal, the Panama Railroad, which opened in 1856 or 1857, and did help a great deal. Okay. Now Ferdinand de Lesseps enters again, fresh from success with the Suez Canal. The great man who had done this and engineered this and financially put it all together was asked by a number of people to put together something and to create a canal across this area. He did this under the auspices, again, of the French government. So the French government negotiated with Colombia. England had not exercised its option. And in 1881, they began construction of a canal at the modern-day Panama Canal site. It was so beguilingly short, 48 miles. The Erie Canal is 363 miles. The Grand Canal is 1,100 miles. It was so beguilingly short. The Suez is 100 miles. It should have been child's play. They did not anticipate all that they ran into. The problem with the Panama Canal was first massive disease, yellow fever and malaria, absolutely debilitating disease. The rivers in the area flooded every year 30, 35 feet above where they normally were. Mudslides constantly. Mudslides that could not be predicted. And the biggest thing was a high mountain, 367 feet. Now think of Napoleon being deterred by a report of 35 feet elevation, 367 feet at the exact continental divide. That's exactly what it was, where the rain went one way, went the other way. They also had no friendly Egypt to give them labor. They did not get 30,000 people every 3 months to do this. De Lesseps tried everything. The work proceeded about 1/5 the pace they had planned. He died in 1894, and the company fell apart in 1894. And this is where the United States comes in. After he died and after the company fell apart, a new company was organized in 1895, but it really wasn't doing anything. I mean, it was trying to get things going, but nothing was working, and the machine that was there was just along the ditches, and it looked like it was a big bust that would never work. Now enter the United States. President McKinley expressed an interest in the canal, and he was a very prudent man. He died in 1901, assassinated. He was succeeded by a person I don't think anyone would call prudent, Theodore Roosevelt. And Theodore Roosevelt, the youngest president, still to this day, ever in office, not the youngest elected because he wasn't elected his first time, Roosevelt was full of energy. He also was a big naval believer. In his second year in office, he sent what he called the Great White Fleet around the world. He wanted to show people American naval power. His first career in government had been as Secretary of the Navy, followed, by the way, his cousin, Franklin, became Secretary of the Navy also 15 years later. He was a big Navy man, and he also, of course, had experience in the Caribbean from his role in the Spanish-American War in Cuba. More than anything else, he wanted to get something, he wanted to bring American naval power on the world scene, and he thought he needed a canal across there to do that. He was given two plans, one through Colombia and one through the old route of the Panama Canal. He took the old route. He took the De Lesseps route. They approached people who owned the company now, and they really just owned it, weren't doing anything, and they said, how can we arrange something? The company agreed to sell it. The company also told Roosevelt that as Gran Colombia was disintegrating, already Venezuela and Ecuador had left Gran Colombia. It was a giant country that the hinterland seemed to be pulling out of, and Roosevelt was told that there were rebels in Panama who also wanted to follow Venezuela and Ecuador in leaving Gran Colombia. Roosevelt told people who knew the area, people who owned this canal, he arranged a financial agreement with them. They came away with money, and they were served as emissaries to the Panamanian rebels. And before the Panamanian rebels had a chance to really organize in any efficient way, Roosevelt said he would recognize them as a country, the new country of Panama. It's often been said that Roosevelt was the father of the Panamanian Revolution. That seems a bit too much because there were rebels there who were angry, but it's not too much to say he was a midwife because it probably would have happened and been an easy birth had it not been for Roosevelt. He sent troops along the Colombian shore to make sure that no Colombian ships could be there to reprovision troops. And he did all sorts of things to get weapons to the Panamanian rebels. No American troops ever fought. And within a year, Panama was an independent country, and they immediately, not surprisingly, signed a 99-year lease with the United States government. There's an interesting thing on signing of the lease, because almost immediately, some Panamanians were angry at that. Almost immediately, some said, wait a minute, we fought a revolution to get out of the control of some other big country, and we don't know this, but behind the scenes, our leaders are giving away a lot of control of our land, which is true. On the other hand, the leaders said, but we wouldn't be a country now if we hadn't given that away. From 1903 on, it's been controversial until the presidency of Jimmy Carter, when it was finally resolved and the canal was repatriated to Panama, which was very, by the way, extremely controversial when he did that. I guess still is to this day. Now, the Panama Canal, they started work immediately at the old route. They devised a new strategy. The old strategy had been a series of locks to go. This new system, do I have it? Do I have it here? Yes. Oh, I don't have it. The new system is a more simple one, but it has 3 locks from the one side, 1, 2, 3, up to the middle, and they built, the biggest thing was to build this huge lake. Lake, I can't pronounce it, Gatum? Gotham. Lake Gotham. This huge lake, and it is, at the time, was the largest man-made lake in the world. And then they built 3 locks to come down on the other side. So you go up, boom, 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 sail across this lake in the middle of the isthmus, and then come down, boom, boom, boom. It worked remarkably well. Before beginning the canal, they did an interesting thing. They sent down workers to build hotels, to build entertainment facilities, to build athletic facilities, to build all. They built infrastructure. They built so when the workers went down there, they would be able to have a reasonably comfortable existence. They also had advantage of the fact that Dr. Walter Reed had discovered that mosquitoes were the carriers of malaria and yellow fever, and they sprayed massively and eliminated all the, virtually, it was a great spectacular spraying, eliminating mosquitoes. So it was fairly much disease-free, not entirely when it was built. So one of the interesting things is that they built this infrastructure, and then they build the canal. In 1913, President Woodrow Wilson sent a telegraph signal electronically that blew a boulder, a couple of boulders up, in which water rushed from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So in 1913, after 400 years of trying to find some way across, the sea waters of the 2 oceans were joined. They did that, by the way, because 1913 was 400 years exactly after Balboa first saw it, the first European to see the Pacific. It was done for symbolic reasons, because the canal couldn't open for another year. But in 1914, it opened. And it's been spectacularly successful. It was the largest engineering project to that date in American history. The final cost was around $10 million in today's dollars. The truth is, that ain't bad. I mean, think of what we get for $10 million today sometimes. And it doesn't seem like, I mean, a lot of money to me. But $10 billion doesn't seem that much. Other strange things about it, the work was done primarily with American supervisors, but West Indian men. 31,000 West Indian men. They went around the islands contracting, many of them were the first generation newly freed or second generation of newly freed slaves, contracting West Indian men to go there. They ended up bringing 31,000 West Indian men, but interestingly enough, once again, they were mindful of having facilities for workers so they wouldn't be angry, they wouldn't die. They allowed the men to bring their families. So all told, the usual estimate is that 220,000 West Indian people moved to Central America because of the workers and their families, and almost all stayed there. It's one of these huge migrations. Well, a lot of the population of the West Indies was already part of a migration, but this is a successful, happy migration, not a forced slave migration. And they stayed there, and obviously the world unfolded. The canal had some unforeseen consequences. Parts of South America were badly injured by it. Chilean ports almost dried up because obviously they depended a lot on ships going around the Cape, coming up and stopping at Chilean ports. My home city of Winnipeg was badly damaged by it. Hard to imagine. Why is that? Winnipeg is right in the heart of Canada. If you go 900 miles to the west, you have prairie. If you go 5 miles to the east, you have lakes and hills and rolling country. Winnipeg was a place where eastern Canada met western Canada, and it's where all the railroads went through, and it was supposed to funnel all the traffic from the Maritimes and Quebec and Ontario to the west, and suddenly it became cheaper for most Canadians in the east to go through the Panama Canal. Winnipeg was growing like a mushroom, and it didn't stop, but it massively reduced its growth. So things like that always have some effects you can't foresee, but it's been an extraordinary success in general. It changed the face of the planet, it's fair to say. The tolls are interesting on that, on the Panama Canal. The average today, I was stunned by this, the average vessel going through today pays $50,000. That's a big ticket to get in the bus, isn't it? $50,000. The highest ever paid was $400,000 by the Norwegian Pearl. You pay based on tonnage, based on amount of time it'll take to get through there, based on value of cargo. Not a surprise, a formula. There is the cheap, oh, by the way, pleasure boats can use the Panama Canal also and do a great deal. They're charged a fair amount for going across. The cheapest toll going across was in 1926, and it was a swimmer who asked to swim it. They didn't know what to do, so they charged a guy 36 cents. So he swam through the Panama Canal and paid, I don't know how you do it with the locks, but they arranged something, I guess he went with ships probably, they charged him 36 cents. I would end only saying I'm stunned by the capacity of mankind to take this huge planet and suddenly say, okay, this is the way it's evolved out of millennia, and we can change that ourselves. And I think often for the better. I'm sure in some ways like global warming, not for the better. That's, of course, not directly intended. That's a byproduct of something. Okay, I'm done, and I'll thank you very much for your presence. Any questions? How are we doing on time? We have around 2 minutes if you have questions.